The wind came first, a high, thin scream that scraped the tops of the lodgepole pines. Then the snow followed, not as flakes, but as a driving, horizontal wall of white that erased the world. It was the kind of storm that Wyoming Territory used in winter to scour the high plains clean, to bury mistakes and freeze the blood of any creature foolish enough to be caught out in it. Eli was just such a creature. He swayed in the saddle, his body a dead weight against the animal's exhaustion. His left shoulder was a furnace of pain, a wet, sticky heat that had long since soaked through his wool coat and frozen stiff. He'd stopped feeling the cold hours ago. Now, there was only the throb from the bullet graze and the desperate, swimming weakness that threatened to pull him down into the snow for the last time. Behind him, somewhere in the white chaos, were the men. He hadn't seen them for a good 2 hours, not since he'd pushed his horse, Bess, down a treacherous game trail. But he could feel them. They were relentless, a posse with a badge and a rope, and they wouldn't stop for a blizzard. They'd just slow down. Eli had to stop, or he'd bleed out before they ever found him. Bess stumbled, her head drooping. "Just a little more, girl," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Just a little more." He was lying to her. There was nothing out here but mountains and wind. He was riding into a white grave. He pulled his hat low, the brim stiff with ice, and squinted into the fury. He was fading, the world turning gray at the edges. Then he saw it. It wasn't much, just a smudge, a darker gray against the white, hanging low in the air. Smoke. It was thin, torn apart by the wind almost as soon as it left the chimney. But it was there. Hope was a dangerous, stupid thing. But it was all he had. He nudged the mare with his knees, his good arm pulling the reins. She grunted, sensing the change, and pushed forward into the trees. The cabin was tucked into a hollow, nestled against a thick stand of pine that broke the worst of the wind. It was a run-down hunter's shack, barely more than a lean-to, with a sod roof heavy with snow and a chimney made of river stone and mud. It looked forgotten, but the smoke was real. He half fell, half slid from the saddle. His legs gave out, and he hit the snow on his knees. Bess stood over him, trembling, her breath pluming in great white clouds. Eli pushed himself up, his good hand gripping the frozen leather of his saddlebag. He staggered the 10 yards to the door, a rough planked thing with a leather hinge. He raised his fist to knock, but the weakness took him. He pitched forward, catching himself against the wood. The door didn't open. Instead, a small wooden slot slid open at eye level. Eli found himself staring into the black, unwavering circle of a rifle barrel. "Go on," a voice said from within. It was a woman's voice, low and rough as corn husk. "Get." "Please," Eli managed, the word tearing at his throat. "I'm hurt. Men. Chasing. I don't care what's chasing you," the voice said. "You're not bringing it here. Turn around." "I can't," he whispered. He could feel the blood, a fresh, hot trickle, running down his side. The world was spinning fast. "I'm done." He heard a sound, a frustrated sigh. The slot snapped shut. He leaned his head against the door, his last bit of strength gone. This was it, then, shot in the back by a lawman, only to die on the doorstep of some half-wild hermit. The door creaked open. He didn't have time to see her, to explain, to plead. He just felt the cold air from the cabin hit his face as he collapsed inward, sprawling onto the hard-packed dirt floor. His last thought was that it was warm. Clara stood over him, the heavy Winchester still held tight in her hands. He was a big man, made bigger by the heavy coat, and he'd fallen like a sack of feed. A dark, wet stain was spreading on the floor beneath him. He was pale, his lips blue, his breathing shallow. He was either a bandit or a victim, and either way, he was trouble. She nudged him with her boot. He groaned, but didn't move. She saw the blood on his shoulder, the ragged tear in the coat. "Damn you," she whispered to the unconscious man. "Damn you for finding me." But she couldn't leave him there, not to bleed out on her floor. and certainly not to die outside where the storm would freeze him solid by morning. And his horse. She'd have to see to the horse. With a sigh that was more anger than pity, she set the rifle against the wall, grabbed him by the collar of his coat, and began to drag him deeper into the one-room cabin. He was heavy, a dead weight, and she grunted with the effort, her boots slipping on the floor. She dragged him close to the hearth, but not so close the heat would bother him. Then she went back, shut the heavy door, and dropped the thick wooden bar into place. She fetched a length of rope from a peg by the door. She was strong, her arms corded with the muscle from chopping wood and hauling water. But he was still a man. If he woke up mean, she'd be in a world of trouble. She didn't trust him. She didn't trust any man, especially one who came with a bullet hole. She found an old, sturdy chair with solid arms and dragged it over. Rolling him and lifting him was the hardest part. He came to for a moment, his eyes hazy and confused. "What? Don't talk," she ordered. She shoved him into the chair and with quick, practiced knots, tied his wrists tight to the arms. She looped the rope around his chest and the chair back, pinning him there. He was too weak to fight her. He slumped against the ropes, his head falling forward. Only then did she feel safe enough to tend the wound. She stoked the fire, adding 2 more logs until it blazed, filling the small space with heat and flickering light. She put a kettle of water on to boil. From a chest under her cot, she pulled a bottle of whiskey, a clean rag, and a needle and thread. She took a knife from her belt and sliced through his coat, the wool and the layers of his shirt beneath. The wound was ugly. The bullet had torn through the meat of his shoulder, missing the bone. Thank God, but leaving a ragged channel. It was caked with frozen blood and bits of wool. He hissed in his sleep as she began to clean it with the hot water. "Hold still," she muttered. Though he was tied fast, she worked with a rough efficiency, her face set in a grim mask. She poured a splash of whiskey directly into the wound. He roared, coming fully awake, his body arching against the ropes. "Son of a... It'll keep the rot from setting in," she said flatly, pushing him back down with a hand on his good shoulder. He stared at her, his eyes wild with pain, finally seeing her clearly. She was not young, maybe 30, maybe older. Her face was thin and angular, with high cheekbones and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. Her brown hair was pulled back in a severe, practical braid, but it was her eyes that held him. They were a pale, clear gray, and they were full of a deep, abiding fear. She was terrified, but her hands were steady. He panted, the fire of the whiskey burning in his flesh. He looked down at the ropes. "You plan on keeping me trussed up like a hog?" he finally rasped. "Only if you act like one," she said, her voice sharp. She didn't stop her work, packing the wound with a clean piece of rag. "Who are you?" "Eli, just Eli." He watched her, a man needing a fire. "You've got lead in you," she stated, tying the bandage tight. He winced. "Men with lead are running from something, or someone. Aren't we all?" he said. His eyes roamed the small cabin. A cot, a table, 2 chairs, a cold box near the door, a few traps hanging on the wall. It was sparse, but clean. "What's a woman doing alone this high up? Run off from your man, or bury him?" Her hand stopped. She looked up, her gray eyes turning to ice. "That's my business." She wiped his blood from her hands onto a dirty towel. She picked up the rifle and sat in the other chair, across the hearth from him. "You look like a bandit. Maybe I should have left you for the wolves." "Maybe you should have." Eli agreed. The pain was settling back into a deep, dull throb. The warmth of the fire was making him heavy. "But you didn't." They sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was the fire and the rising shriek of the blizzard outside. The wind hit the cabin, and the small structure groaned. Snow hissed against the single, greased paper window. Clara stared out that window, at the solid wall of white. She looked back at the man. He was pale, but the color was starting to return to his face. He was rough-looking, with a week's worth of dark stubble and lines of hardship etched around his eyes. He was dangerous, she was sure of it, But he was also trapped. "You can't ride in this," she said, her voice resigned. "Your horse is in the lean-to. She's half dead. And those men, if they're still out there, this storm will swallow them whole. No one is coming for you." He met her gaze. "And you? No one is coming for me, either," she said. She made her decision. She stood up, walked over to him, and with her knife, she sawed through the ropes on his wrists. He rubbed his numb hands, but made no move to stand. "The floor," she said, pointing to a pile of furs by the fire. "I'll feed you. When the storm breaks, you leave. You don't try anything. You don't ask questions. You hear me? Loud and clear." Eli said. He used the chair to push himself to his feet. He was dizzy, and his shoulders screamed. But he stood. He was taller than she was by a head. He looked down at her, and for a second, the sarcasm in his eyes softened. "Thank you, ma'am." "My name is Clara," she said, turning her back to him. "And I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for the horse. It's a good animal. Doesn't deserve to die for its rider's stupidity." He let out a low chuckle, which turned into a cough. "Fair enough." He stumbled to the pallet of furs and collapsed onto them, pulling one over his feverish body. Clara watched him from the corner of her eye, the rifle never leaving her hand, until his breathing deepened into the ragged sleep of the wounded and exhausted. For 2 days, the storm was king. It buried the cabin up to the window, plunging the single room into a dim, gray twilight. The wind never stopped, a constant, high-pitched moan that wormed its way through the chinking in the logs. They were trapped, 2 strangers in a box barely 10 feet square, while Eli slept. Clara sat. She stared into the fire, her hands clenching and unclenching in her lap. She was a prisoner again, but this time her jailer was the weather. And the man, her hand drifted to her side, rubbing the place where the ribs had healed badly. She could still feel the print of his boot. She closed her eyes, and she was back there. The smell of stale beer and expensive cigar smoke, the polished dark wood of the saloon bar, the one he'd slammed her against. His voice, not shouting, but low and thick with a cold rage. "My wife, Clara, a jewel. But jewels need to be kept in a box. Don't you forget it." She remembered the silence after, the heavy, terrible silence of the rooms upstairs, waiting for his footsteps on the stairs. She remembered the glint of the small derringer she had stolen from his desk, and the weight of the gold coins in her pocket. She had walked for weeks, stolen a mule, and found this cabin, abandoned by a trapper. It was hers. It was safe. Until now. She opened her eyes, her hand falling to the small, whittled bird in her pocket. She clutched it hard. "Never again," she whispered to the flames, her voice so low the sleeping man couldn't hear. "Don't go back! Don't you ever go back!" On the second night, the fever took hold of Eli. He'd been quiet, sleeping or just staring at the ceiling. But now he began to toss on the pallet. His good arm thrashed, fighting off invisible demons. He muttered, his voice thick and urgent. No, Your Honor, it's a lie. The ledgers, they prove it," he groaned, his hand flying to his wounded shoulder as if to ward off a blow. He paid them. He paid them all." Clara watched him from her chair. She'd seen fever dreams before, but this one was different. It wasn't just sickness. It was guilt. "Run, Thomas!" he suddenly shouted, his voice cracking with such despair that Clara flinched. "Get out of sight! Run!" He settled back into a low moan, his face tight with a grief that looked ancient. "Thomas! Oh, God, Tommy!" She didn't know these names. She knew nothing of courthouses or ledgers. She only knew the sound of a man in torment. She waited. He was a stranger, a potential threat, but the sound of his grief, it was a language she understood. She dipped a rag in the cool water bucket and wrung it out. She crossed the floor and knelt beside him. He was burning up. She hesitated, then gently placed the cool, wet rag on his forehead. He didn't startle. His thrashing quieted. He let out a long, shuddering breath, as if a great weight had been lifted. He didn't wake, but he settled, Clara stayed there for a moment, her hand resting on the rag, feeling the heat radiate from him. She saw the scar on his jaw, white and thin, and the deep lines of exhaustion. He was younger than she had first thought. She retreated to her chair. The storm raged. The man slept. And the cabin held them both, a tiny, fragile island in a sea of white. By the fourth day, the wind had died, but the snow was still falling, thick and silent. The world outside was muffled. The silence inside the cabin was heavier. Eli was awake, the fever broken. He was weak, his shoulder ached, but his mind was clear. He sat propped against the cabin wall, the fur pallet wrapped around him. Clara was busy. She split kindling with a small hatchet, her movements precise and angry. She scraped the last of the salted pork from a barrel. She checked her traps by the door, finding them empty. Supplies were low. The tension was a third person in the room. They had to speak. "Need more wood for the fire," she said, not looking at him. "I can," he began, moving to stand. The pain shot through his shoulder, and he gritted his teeth, falling back. "You can't do anything," she snapped. "Sit down before you tear the wound open. You're no good to me, dead. You'll eat too much as it is." He looked at her, a spark of his old sarcasm returning. "My, such sweetness. You'll spoil a man. Clara." She froze. The hatchet stopped, hovering over the log. She turned her head slowly. Her gray eyes narrowed to slits. "How did you know my name?" He'd made a mistake. He tried to cover it. You said it in your sleep." "I don't talk in my sleep." "You did," he insisted, lying easily. "You were whispering. Don't go back, Clara." He'd guessed right. He saw it in the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her knuckles whitened on the hatchet handle. He had struck a nerve, a deep one. She turned her back to him, splitting the kindling with 3 sharp, violent cracks. She didn't speak again for an hour. The crack was there. He had seen her. She had been seen. It was the most dangerous thing that had happened to her in months. That evening, the atmosphere began to change. It was impossible to maintain that level of pure hostility when you were 2 people sharing the last of the food in a world that had shrunk to the size of a single room. The tension was still there, but it was no longer just mistrust. It was awareness. She handed him a tin cup of stew. It was thin, mostly rabbit broth from an old kill, with a handful of dried beans. It was barely food. They ate in their usual silence, sitting on opposite sides of the hearth. "This is fine stew," Eli said, scraping the bottom of the cup. "It's broth," she replied, her eyes on the fire. "Don't lie. A man can be polite. A man can be quiet, too." She shot back. She sighed, a small, tired sound. "There's not much left. If this snow doesn't stop, we're in trouble." "I've been in trouble before," he said. "This kind is different. This kind is slow. It starves you. It freezes you. You're a cheerful companion, Clara." A tiny ghost of a smile touched her lips, so fast he almost missed it. "And you're a talkative one." Later, his shirt, which she had washed and hung to dry, was stiff. The bullet hole was a ragged tear. She sat by the lantern, her sewing kit in her lap. Her hands, he noticed, were chapped and red, the knuckles raw, but her stitches were small, neat and incredibly fast. She was mending his shirt. He watched her hands, the way the needle dipped and rose, pulling the black thread taut, closing the wound in the fabric. "You have good hands," he said, his voice quiet. She stopped stitching. She looked down at her own hands as if they belonged to someone else. She saw the calluses from the axe, the broken nail on her right thumb, the faint scar across her palm. She curled them into fists and hid them in her lap. "They're working hands," she said, her voice defensive. "They're steady." Eli said, his gaze unwavering. "Strong. You sewed me up like a field doctor." She didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever complimented her hands. They had been criticized for being rough, for not being soft, for not being ladylike. She picked up the shirt again, her head bent low. and continued to sew. The compliment settled in the quiet space between them, warming it more than the fire. That night, the deep, heavy cold of the high country settled into the cabin. The fire fought it, but the corners of the room were laced with frost. Eli was on his pallet. Clara was on her cot, wrapped in every blanket she owned. It was deep in the night, the hour when the world holds its breath, when the fire is lowest. Clara cried out. It was not a loud scream. It was a sharp, terrified sound that was choked off before it could fully form, a gasp of pure, animal fear. Eli was awake instantly. His body tensed, his good hand reaching for the pistol that was no longer on his hip. His eyes snapped open. Scanning the dark room, he saw her. She was bolt upright on the cot, her hands clamped over her mouth as if to hold the scream in. Her eyes were wide, blind with terror. She was shaking so violently the small wooden cot rattled against the wall. "Don't!" she was whispering, the words broken by sobs. "Please, no, I'll be good. I'm sorry. Please." Eli's first instinct was to go to her, to put a hand on her shoulder, to shake her awake. But he stopped. He had seen that look before, in men broken by war and in women broken by men. She wasn't seeing him. She was seeing someone else. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that if he touched her, she would fight him like a cornered cat. It would be a violation. So he moved, slowly, deliberately, so as not to startle her. He pushed the furs off and got to his feet. His boots were quiet on the packed dirt floor. He crossed the 10 feet to the small table where the lantern sat. His back was to her. He struck a match. The scrape of the sulfur on the matchbox was loud, a violent scratch in the stillness. He lit the lantern. The wick caught, and a warm, steady yellow light bloomed, pushing the heavy shadows back into the corners of the cabin. Clara gasped, her eyes flying from the darkness to the flame. Her breathing was ragged, torn from her lungs. Her eyes slowly focused on the light, then on him. He was standing by the table, not looking at her, but not ignoring her. His good arm was resting on the table's surface. He was making no move toward her. He was just a man, standing in the light. He waited, letting her terror recede. He waited for her to see him, to see the cabin walls, to come back from wherever she had been. Finally, she let out a long, shuddering breath. The tears were still streaming down her face, but the blind panic was gone. He turned his head then, and looked at her. He didn't say, "It was just a dream." He didn't ask her what was wrong. He knew what was wrong. His voice was low, rough from sleep, but it was the steadiest thing she had ever heard. "You're safe." He didn't say anything else. He just let the light and the 2 words hang in the air, a shield against the night. She watched him, her body still trembling, but the shaking was easing. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, making herself small. She looked at him, and he looked at her. It was a long, silent moment. Finally, she gave a single, jerking nod. He nodded back. He turned, picked up a log from the woodpile, and added it to the fire. Sparks flew up the chimney. Then he went back to his own pallet on the floor, leaving the lantern burning bright on the table between them. The lantern burned until the oil was gone, guttering out in the gray hours before dawn. The cabin returned to the cold and the silence. When Clara woke, the first thing she felt was the chill. The second was the shame. He had seen her broken. Eli was already awake, sitting on his pallet, his back against the wall. He was staring into the dying embers of the fire. He didn't look at her. He gave her the dignity of ignoring her, of pretending the night had not happened. For that, she was almost grateful. The storm, however, paid no mind to their fragile truce. It did not break. It settled in. For 3 more days. The snow fell. It was a different kind of snow now. Not a violent, driving wind, but a thick, silent, endless curtain of white. It muffled the world, burying the cabin in a deep, soft tomb. The air inside grew stale, thick with the smell of wood smoke, old coffee, and 2 people kept in close quarters. The real trouble, the one that finally broke their silence, was the food. On the morning of what they guessed was the 8th day, Clara stood before the open cold box. There was nothing left: a rind of salt pork, a handful of dried beans, and half a sack of flour. The coffee tin was empty. "We're out," she said, her voice flat. She stared at the empty shelves. She had planned for a long winter, but for one, not for two, and not for a horse in the lean-to, eating her precious hay. Eli pushed himself to his feet. His shoulder was healing. It was still a hot coal beneath his skin, but the tearing pain was gone. He could move his arm, stiffly. "I saw traps on the wall. They're empty," she said, her back still to him. "Everything is buried. Nothing's moving out there. Not even a fool." "Well," he said, pulling his stiff, mended shirt over his head, "we've got one fool right here. 2, if you're coming." She turned, her eyes sharp. "I'm the one who knows how to hunt. You're the one who knows how to bleed." "I can walk," he said, his voice stubborn. "I can carry whatever you shoot. You'll slow me down. Then you'd better shoot fast." He pulled on his boots. He was not asking. She stared at him for a long, hard moment. She hated this, hated the reliance, hated the way he was pushing into her world. But he was right. She couldn't drag a deer back by herself, and a rabbit wouldn't be enough. She needed him. "Fine," she snapped. "Wrap your feet. It's 4 feet deep out there. And if you make a sound, I'll leave you in a drift." They stepped out of the cabin into a world that had been erased. The sky was a low, oppressive sheet of gray. The snow was a vast, rolling ocean of white, unbroken by any track, any tree branch, any life. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of their own movements. The cold was a physical thing, a weight that pressed against the chest and stole the breath. Clara moved with a grim purpose. She had the Winchester. Eli, his face wrapped in a scarf, followed a few paces behind. He had his own gun, but she had seen the way his arm favored his side. He was in no shape to shoot true. He watched her. She moved like no woman he had ever known. She didn't fight the snow. She seemed to read it, finding the packed drifts that would hold their weight, avoiding the deep, soft powder that would swallow them. She was part of the landscape, her eyes scanning, her body tense. For an hour, they saw nothing. The world was dead. Eli's bad shoulder was aching with the cold, a deep, throbbing pain. He was beginning to think this was a fool's errand. Clara stopped. She didn't turn or speak. She just held up her hand. Eli froze. He followed her gaze. At first, he saw nothing, just snow. Then, 100 yards off, by the skeleton of a frozen willow, he saw it, a tiny flick of movement, a patch of gray-white fur, a snowshoe hare, digging for bark. Clara moved so slowly she barely seemed to move at all. She sank to one knee, the rifle coming up to her shoulder in a single, fluid motion. She became part of the snow. She didn't breathe. She didn't blink. Eli held his own breath, watching her. The crack of the rifle was a shocking, violent sound in the white silence. It echoed flatly off the trees. The rabbit kicked, a small, dark spasm on the snow, and was still. Clara didn't cheer. She just lowered the rifle, pushed herself to her feet, and waded through the drift to retrieve her kill. She held it up by the ears. It was thin, but it was meat. "You're good with that," Eli said, taking it from her. The blood dripped, dark red, onto the pure white. "I had to learn," she said, "or starve. Let's go back. This place gives me the creeps." The walk back was easier. They had a purpose, a small victory that warmed them. They were, for that 1 hour, a team. That night, the smell of roasting rabbit filled the cabin. It was a feast. They ate with their fingers, the hot, stringy meat a balm. They were sitting by the fire, the bones in a pile between them. The mood was lighter. The shared hunt had broken something. Another wall. "What will you do?" Eli asked, his voice quiet. "When this storm finally breaks." "You can't stay here, not really." She was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. "I'll go west," she said, her voice so low he had to lean in to hear it. I heard about a place, Oregon, by the ocean. They say it's green. They say the water is so big you can't see the other side. She looked at him, her gray eyes filled with a desperate, childish longing. You can't be cornered. You see, not if there's nothing behind you but water. You feel cornered here, he stated. I feel cornered everywhere, she whispered. She looked down, her moment of openness gone. She turned it on him, her voice hardening. What about you? Back to your courthouse? You were shouting about a judge in your fever. His face darkened. The small warmth from the meal vanished. No? Why not? You're a lawman, aren't you? Or you were. I was a deputy, he said, his voice flat. He picked up a stick and poked at the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. I believed in things. I believed if you wrote things down in a book, that made them true. I believed if a man put his hand on a Bible, he'd be struck down if he lied. You don't believe that anymore. No, he said. He stared at the flames. Justice is a word. It's a shiny rock that men hold up to blind you while they pick your pocket with the other hand. It's a lie we tell ourselves so we can sleep at night. So, what do you believe in now, Eli? He looked at her. His eyes were dark, his face harsh in the firelight. Staying alive, he said. That's it. That's the whole list. She nodded slowly. She understood that. That was a religion she could follow. The next days passed in a new kind of tension. The open hostility was gone, replaced by a quiet, vibrating awareness. The cabin was too small. They were always touching, brushing past each other. When he reached for the coffee pot, his arm brushed her shoulder. When she bent to the fire, her hair swept against his knee. Each accidental contact was a jolt, a silent, unacknowledged shock. The storm had eased, though the snow still lay in a thick blanket, trapping them. But light now streamed through the single window. One morning, Eli woke and ran his good hand over his jaw. The stubble was thick, an itchy, ragged mess. I need to shave, he said. Clara just nodded, pointing to a small, cracked mirror hanging by a nail on the wall, and the straight razor that lay on the shelf beneath it. He heated a small pan of water by the fire. He took the razor, a mug of soapy water, and went to the window, where the light was best. He hung the mirror on a peg. To get the proper angle, to see his own throat, he had to pull his mended shirt off. Clara was sitting on her cot, pretending to mend one of her furs. She told herself not to look. It was indecent. He was a stranger, but she looked. The light from the window was bright and unforgiving. It lit the muscles of his back, the hard line of his jaw. His skin was pale where the sun hadn't touched it. The bandage on his shoulder was a stark white against him. She watched the muscles in his good arm flex as he worked the razor. The scrape, 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 a rhythmic, masculine sound in the quiet room. She watched the line of his neck as he tilted his head, the vulnerability of his throat. She found she was holding her breath. This was not a monster. This was not the brute from her nightmares. This was just a man, strong, wounded, and real. She stared too long. He glanced up, his own blue eyes meeting hers in the small, cracked reflection. He saw her watching. He didn't smile, not quite, but the corner of his mouth quirked. He knew. Clara flushed, a hot, angry red that crept up her neck. She dropped her gaze back to the fur, her fingers fumbling with the needle. "Don't you dull my razor," she muttered, her voice sharp to cover the tremor in it. "I'll be careful," he said, his voice soft. He turned back to the window. The air in the cabin was thick, and it was no longer just from the wood smoke. That afternoon, it was her turn. It had been more than a week. The confinement, the sweat from the hunt, the stink of fear. She felt unclean. She had to wash. She strung a rope from one wall to the other, a flimsy line that sagged in the middle, over it. She hung her spare blanket, creating a small, sad corner of privacy. It hid nothing, really. "Turn around," she ordered him. Eli was sitting at the table, cleaning the rifle. He didn't argue. He didn't look. He just turned his chair so that his back was to her. He focused on the gunmetal, on the oily rag in his hands. He heard everything. He heard the rustle of her wool dress as she pulled it over her head. He heard the splash of water as she poured it from the kettle into the tin basin. He heard the soft, wet sound of the rag as she dipped it, and the quiet, sighing sound of it moving over her skin. He heard her shiver as the cold air hit her wet body. He gripped the rifle, his knuckles white. He was trying to be a gentleman. He was trying to be decent. He was trying to think about ledgers, about pauses, about anything other than the woman behind the blanket. Then he heard her hum. It was a small, broken sound, a tune so old it had no name. It was the sound of a woman who had, for just one moment, forgotten to be afraid. A woman who was just washing. The sound broke through his defenses in a way her fear never could. It was the most intimate thing he had ever heard. It was human and real, and it made his throat tighten. He shut his eyes. He shut them tight, fighting a sudden, fierce wave of desire that was so tangled up with tenderness it confused him. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to touch her. The two thoughts were becoming dangerously hard to separate. The humming stopped. The splashing stopped. "You can turn back," she said. Her voice was small. He took a deep breath and turned. She was dressed again, her hair dark and damp, combed back from her face. She was kneeling by the fire, her head bent, refusing to meet his gaze. Neither of them spoke of it. That night, the cold returned with a vengeance. The firewood pile was low, dangerously low. They couldn't afford to keep a roaring fire. Eli banked it, the logs glowing a dull, menacing red, giving off barely any heat. The cold crept in. It was a living thing, a predator. Eli lay on his pallet. Clara lay on her cot. They were wrapped in every fur and blanket they owned. It was not enough. An hour past midnight. Eli could hear her teeth chattering. He was shivering himself, his whole body aching with a deep, penetrating chill. "This is stupid," he said, his voice a low growl in the darkness. "We're going to freeze. We'll be dead by morning." He stood up, dragging his pallet of furs with him. He crossed the 2 feet of floor. "Move over." Clara stiffened. She could see his silhouette against the dying fire. "What are you doing?" "Sharing heat. It's the only way." He didn't wait for her to argue. He threw his furs on top of her cot and climbed in, his back to her. The cot was narrow, groaning under their combined weight. "Lie still. It's just to stay alive." They lay back to back, 2 rigid, cold bodies, not touching. The cold was still winning. "It only works if we share," he muttered, his voice full of frustration. He rolled onto his back. "Stop being stubborn, Clara." She hesitated. He was right. Her feet were numb. Her hands ached, slowly, stiffly. She rolled onto her back. They were side by side, shoulder to shoulder, arm against arm. The warmth was immediate. It was a shock. The heat of his body against hers. It was life. They lay in silence for a long time. The shivering slowly subsided. The numbness in her feet began to recede. He was a furnace beside her. He was solid and real. She was exhausted. The fear, the cold, the tension. It had worn her down to nothing. Her body betrayed her. Her head grew heavy. It tilted, slowly, and came to rest on his good shoulder. She sighed, a small, tired sound, and tucked her body against his side. Eli went rigid. She was pressed against him, from shoulder to knee. He could feel the curve of her hip, the softness of her breast against his arm. He could smell her hair, the faint scent of soap and wood smoke. His heart, which had been beating slow and steady, began to hammer against his ribs. He wanted, more than anything, to put his arm around her, to pull her closer. He did not. He lay as still as stone. He had to break this. The silence was too full. "You should sleep in the bed," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I'll take the floor. You can have my furs." She didn't move. Her voice was a murmur against his shirt, so quiet he almost didn't hear it. "I'm warmer here." He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He didn't move either. They lay like that, in the dark, sharing breath, sharing heat. The line had been crossed. The cabin held them. She spoke first, her voice still muffled, still pressed against him. "What are you running from, Eli? The real reason. Men don't get a posse on them for a bad decision." He tensed. The wall was back. He could feel her, warm and soft, trusting him in the dark. And he was going to lie to her. "It's complicated. It involves other people. The courthouse," she whispered. "The judge, and Thomas. You cried for Thomas." His whole body went cold. "You heard that. You were in a fever. You shouted." He was silent. He couldn't tell her. He couldn't tell her that Thomas was his brother, his younger brother, that he had been killed because of those ledgers, because of that judge, that the lawman he was accused of killing, he had killed him. "It's my burden, Clara, not yours." She could feel his retreat, the way his heart rate changed, the way his muscles tensed. He was shutting her out. She could feel the wall he was building. It was a familiar feeling. He knew he had hurt her. He had to turn it. He had to know. He could feel the small, sharp bone of her hip pressed against him. He could feel the way she breathed, shallow and careful, even in her sleep. His voice was gentle, but it cut through the darkness. "Who broke your ribs?" "Clara." She stopped breathing. It was as if he had struck her. Every muscle in her body went taut. She pulled her head back, trying to see his face in the dark, but there was only shadow. How did you know?" "I've seen it," he said, his voice quiet, almost sad. "You flinch when you reach for the high shelf. You sleep with your arm across your chest, like you're guarding something. You did it last night, in your nightmare." "Who was he?" She tore herself away from him, scrambling to a sitting position, pulling the blankets up to her chin. She was cold again, a deep, bone cold that had nothing to do with the weather. She was trapped. He had seen her. "I'm nobody's wife anymore," she hissed, the words a shield, her only defense. He sat up too, the cold air hitting his bare chest. He didn't care. He looked at her, a shadow sitting opposite him. "That's not what I asked." The silence in the cabin was terrible. The fire popped, a small, lonely sound. She was shaking. He could see her outline trembling. He had pushed too hard. He had broken the fragile peace. He waited. She didn't answer. She couldn't. She couldn't give him that name. She should have been terrified of him. He was a man. He was bigger than her. He had seen her weakness, but he was just sitting there, waiting, not demanding, not shouting. Slowly, her shaking hand emerged from the blankets. She reached across the small space between them. Her hand was trembling, but her intent was clear. She pressed her palm flat against his chest, right over his heart. She felt it, the steady, solid beat. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of staying alive. It was the sound of safe. He didn't move, letting her feel his life, his stillness. Then, his own hand, large and calloused, covered hers. He didn't push it away. He just held it there, trapping it against his skin, sharing his warmth. He lifted her hand from his chest. He turned it over. He looked down at her knuckles, red and chapped from work, and pale in the dim light. He lowered his head and kissed them, a soft, warm press of his lips against her skin. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of respect, an apology, a promise. A single tear broke free and rolled down her cheek. It was the first tear she had shed since she'd run. She tried to pull her hand back. "Don't," she whispered, her voice raw. "Don't kiss me unless you mean it." He didn't let go of her hand. He lifted his head, and his eyes found hers in the dark. He could see the glint of her tears. "I mean everything I do," he said. His kiss on her knuckles was a brand. They lay in the dark of the cot, not touching, but the space between them was a live wire. Sleep was impossible. They had said too much, and not enough. They had crossed a line. From two strangers surviving a storm to two people who had seen the raw, broken parts of each other. It was a more dangerous intimacy than any touch. When the light finally came, it was sudden and brilliant. The storm had broken. Eli rose from the cot. He didn't look at her. He just moved to the fire, his body stiff, and began to build it up. Clara turned her face to the wall, a hot, confused shame washing over her. She had been weak. She had let him see her fear. And then she had, rested her head on him, let him hold her hand? She felt foolish and exposed. "It stopped," Eli said, his voice flat. He pulled on his boots. "The snow. It's over." The silence from outside was startling. For more than a week, the wind had been a constant scream. Now, there was nothing, just a deep, profound stillness. "I need to check the horse," he said. "See if she's still breathing." He took his rifle and unbarred the door. The light that flooded the cabin was blinding. It was a pure, painful white, reflecting off the mountains of new snow. Eli squinted, his hand raised to shield his eyes, and stepped out. Clara followed him. The air was so cold it felt like swallowing glass. The world was remade. Every tree was draped in white. The drifts piled up to the cabin's roof on one side. The sky was a high, aching blue. It was beautiful, and it was terrible. Eli was wading through the chest-deep snow toward the lean-to. Clara's gaze drifted, scanning the new, clean world, and then she saw them. They were faint, already filling with new snow, but undeniable. Tracks. They came from the line of trees to the south, circled the cabin in a wide, cautious arc, and then returned to the trees. A single man, on foot. He had been there. During the worst of the storm, someone had stood in the woods, watching her chimney smoke. Clara's breath seized in her chest. A cold, black terror, far worse than the winter air, shot through her. It wasn't the posse. A posse wouldn't send one man on foot in a blizzard. This was something else. This was a hunter. Eli. Her voice was a choked whisper. He stopped, turning from the lean-to. He saw her face, white as the snow, her eyes wide with a panic that was bone deep. He followed her pointing finger. He waded over, his face grim, and knelt by the nearest track. He studied it for a long minute. "One man," he said, his voice low. "Came in quiet. He wore town boots, not moccasins. He watched. He didn't want to be seen." "He found me," Clara whispered, her hands flying to her mouth. "Oh, God, he found me. It's him. It's Arthur. Your husband. He has men, trackers. He said he'd find me. He said he'd drag me back." She was shaking, her eyes darting to the trees, as if she expected him to step out. Eli stood up. The wounded man was gone. In his place was the deputy. His eyes were cold and hard, scanning the hills, the ridges, the shadows. He raised his rifle, resting it in the crook of his arm. "He was here yesterday, maybe the day before. The storm covered his trail out. He's probably halfway back to town by now, but he knows. We have to go," she said, her voice rising to a thin wail. "I have to go now." "Bess is half dead," Eli said, nodding to the lean-to, where the horse stood, hip-shot and listless. "She can't carry one of us, let alone two, and not through this." "Then I'll walk." Clara spun, wading, plunging back to the cabin. "I'll go alone. I have to. He can't find me here." She was frantic, bursting through the door. She grabbed her sack and began stuffing the last of the flour into it. Her hands were shaking so badly she spilled half of it on the floor. Eli followed her in. The cabin felt small, a trap. "Clara, stop! You're not thinking. You don't understand." She wheeled on him, her face a mask of terror. "You don't know him. He won't just. He'll hurt me. He'll make an example of me. And you think you'll last an hour out there?" he said, his voice hard, trying to cut through her panic. "You'll be snowblind by noon and frozen by nightfall." "It's better than him," she screamed. She pointed a trembling finger at him. You're trouble. You have a posse after you. Now he's coming. You're a beacon for it. I have to get away from you. I'll go alone." She was trying to cut him loose, trying to save herself. She was running, just as she had been running all along. He crossed the room in 2 strides and grabbed her arms. Not gently. His grip was a vice, his fingers digging into her wool sleeves, forcing her to be still, to look at him. "Stop it," he commanded. His voice was cold, angry. "You think I'm just going to let you walk out that door to die? You think I'm that man? Let me go!" She struggled, twisting in his grasp, but he was too strong. "No," he said, and his voice was raw. "You helped me. You pulled me from that snow. You didn't let me bleed out on your floor. I'm not letting you go without a fight." The words hit her like a physical blow. She stopped struggling. She stared at him, her chest heaving. No one had ever said that to her. No one had ever stood between her and the world. Her terror was still there, but beneath it, something else flickered, a fragile, disbelieving spark. He let go of her arms. His anger faded, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. They stood in the middle of the ruined cabin, the spilled flour a white scar on the dark floor. "We're trapped," she whispered. The fight gone, replaced by a hollow despair. "His man knows I'm here. Your posse is out there. We're going to die here." "Maybe," Eli said. He walked to the hearth and sat down, rubbing his face with his good hand. "But not today, and not like this." He looked at her. She was still standing by the table, looking lost, a child in a too large world. "You need to know who I am. Clara, the real reason." He had to make her trust him. He had to give her the truth. All of it. He owed her that much. "I told you I was a deputy. In Laramie, it was a good town. Or I thought it was. I was young. I believed in the badge." He stared into the fire, but he was seeing something else. A dusty street. A courthouse. "There's a judge there," he said, his voice flat. "Harris, man runs the whole county, owns the bank, the freight office, and the law." I started seeing things, cases thrown out, men I knew were guilty walking free, men who were innocent, just vanishing. He was taking bribes, from the railroad, from cattle barons, from anyone with enough money to buy a piece of the state. Clara was listening, her panic forgotten, drawn in by the bleakness in his voice. She slowly sat in the other chair. "I was stupid," he went on. "I thought I could stop him. I found his ledgers, proof, names, dates, amounts. I told my partner, an older man, a man I trusted. He told me to burn the books. He said I was going to get us all killed. I didn't listen. I told him I was taking them to the endorse. Marshal." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I testified. In a closed room. The marshal believed me. He said he'd get warrants. I thought I'd won." He picked up a stick, his knuckles white. "Judge Harris has a lot of friends. He found out. He couldn't get to me. I was under guard. So he went after my brother." "Thomas," Clara whispered. Eli nodded, his throat working. "Thomas, he was 19. Just came west to join me. He didn't know anything about it. He just looked like me. From a distance, they shot him in the back, in an alley. Said it was a robbery, but they didn't take his wallet." The stick in his hand snapped. "I knew who did it. A hired man from one of the ranches, and I knew who paid him. I went to find my partner, the one who told me to burn the books. He was packing. He was running. He'd been on Harris's payroll for 10 years. He set me up. He told Harris I was coming. He set Thomas up." "What did you do?" Clara asked, though she already knew. "He pulled a gun on me, or he started to... I was faster." Eli looked up from the fire, his eyes a cold, clear blue. "The man I'm running from, the posse. They're not chasing a deputy. They're chasing a man who murdered another lawman. That's the story Harris is telling. And he's got the paper to make it true." The cabin was silent. The weight of his story settled in the small room. A physical, cold thing. He had given her his life, his guilt, his death sentence. Clara watched him. He was a good man who had done a terrible thing for the right reason, and he was being hunted for it. She thought of her own life, the smallness of her fear, the lies she had lived with. He had given her his truth. She owed him hers. "My name," she said, her voice clear and hard. A new sound. "Is Clara Withers, or it was my maiden name. My married name is Croft." Eli's head snapped up. Arthur Croft, of Cheyenne. He knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew it. Croft's Palace, a 3-story saloon and gambling hall, the biggest west of Omaha. Arthur Croft owned politicians, sheriffs, and people. "My father," Clara said, her voice dead, her eyes fixed on a crack in the floor, "was a fool. He liked cards. He liked pretending he was a big man. He wasn't. He played against Arthur one night. He lost everything. The ranch, the horses, everything." She took a shaky breath. "And then he kept playing. He put me in the pot. I was 16. Arthur, he thought it was a fine joke. He collected me the next day, along with the deed to the ranch." Eli felt a cold sickness rise in his gut. This was worse than bribes. This was slavery. "He married me," she continued, her voice a monotone. "He liked things to be legal. He liked showing me off. He called me his Wyoming jewel. He bought me silk dresses and pearls, and he kept me in a set of rooms on the 3rd floor. He locked the door from the outside." She finally looked at him. Her gray eyes were not afraid. They were dead. "And when I wasn't the jewel he wanted, when I spoke out of turn, or didn't smile for his friends, he would correct me." She touched her side, where the ribs had healed. "He told me he owned me, that I was his property, same as his horse, same as his saloon, and that if I ever ran, he would pay men to hunt me down, drag me back, and break my legs so I would never walk again." "Clara," Eli whispered, his voice thick. "I've been running for 3 months," she said, her voice suddenly fierce. "I stole money from his safe. I stole a horse. I've been living in barns and gullies. I found this place. I thought I was finally free. I thought he'd give up." "A man like that," Eli said, "never gives up, not on what he thinks he owns." They sat in the ruins of their lives, 2 fugitives, 2 people who had, in their own ways, killed. He, a corrupt lawman. She, the ghost of the girl she had been. He was running from a lie that would see him hanged. She was running from a truth that would see her caged. The air in the cabin was no longer cold. It was electric. They had stripped themselves bare. There were no more secrets, no more walls. There was only the truth, and the 2 of them, and the world that was coming to kill them. Night fell. They hadn't eaten. They hadn't moved. They sat by the fire, the confessions hanging in the air between them, a shared, terrible burden. Eli looked at her. He saw her, not as a victim, not as a runaway, but as a survivor. He saw the steel under the fear. Clara looked at him. He was not a bandit. He was not a threat. He was a man drowning in grief, and he had just refused to let her drown alone. She couldn't stand the silence. She couldn't stand the pity she saw in his eyes. She couldn't stand being the broken thing. She had to do something. She had to prove she was alive. She stood up. Eli watched her, his body tensing. She crossed the small space between them and stood in front of him. He didn't move. He sat in the chair, looking up at her. "He's coming," she said, her voice a low tremble. "Your posse is coming. We're not going to make it, are we?" "I don't know," Eli said honestly. "But I'll get you out, or die trying. I don't want to die afraid," she whispered. Her hands were shaking. She reached out, her fingers tangling in the front of his mended shirt. "I don't want to be afraid anymore." She pulled his face down to hers. Her mouth crashed against his. It was not a kiss. It was a collision. It was desperate and angry and full of fear. Her teeth grazed his lip. Her hands clawed at his shirt, pulling him closer. It was the kiss of a woman who had been starved, who had been silenced, who was taking, for the first time in her life, exactly what she wanted. A groan tore from Eli's chest. His good arm snaked around her waist, pulling her from her feet and onto his lap, his hand tangling in her hair. tilting her head back. He kissed her back with the same desperation, the same raw, pent-up force. It was grief and rage and a terrible, aching need. He was the first man to touch her in kindness. She was the first person to see him as a man, not a murderer. He kicked the chair away, and they sank to the pile of furs by the fire, a tangle of limbs and mouths. It was not gentle. It was not slow. It was a desperate, urgent claiming of life in the face of death. It was clumsy and raw and emotional. His shirt was torn open. Her hair came undone, falling around them. He whispered apologies against her skin. He didn't know why. For his roughness, for his past, for the world. She gasped, a sound that was half pain, half release, as she arched against him, finally breaking free. They moved together, two halves of a whole. Broken thing. Finding a moment of solace in the eye of the storm. They were not making love. They were making a stand. Afterward, they lay tangled in the furs. The fire was dying, casting long shadows. The cabin was silent, but it was a new silence, full, the reality of what they had done, who they were. Settled on Clara, the old shame, the voice of her husband, came creeping back. This is what he said she was. This is what he would call her. She pulled away from Eli's warmth, huddling in a blanket, her back to him. "You'll leave," she said. Her voice was flat, dead. It was not a question. "When the light comes, when you can ride, you'll leave. They'll stop chasing you eventually." Eli lay on his back, staring at the sod roof. He felt her retreat. He saw her pulling back into that dark, cold place her husband had built for her. He would not let her go. He rolled onto his side. He reached out, his calloused fingers touching her jaw, gently but firmly, forcing her to turn, to look at him. "They're never going to stop chasing me, Clara," he said, his voice raw. "A man like Harris, a man like your husband, they don't stop, ever." She stared at him, her eyes wide and wet in the dim light. "And I'll stay," he said, his voice dropping to a low, fierce whisper. "Until you ask me to go?" It was a promise, a terrible, impossible promise. He was chaining himself to her past. She searched his face, looking for the lie, for the trick. She found none. She saw only his own broken past, and a resolve that terrified her. She didn't know how to answer. So she just nodded, and let a single tear trace a path through the soot on her cheek. Morning came too soon. It was bright, cold, and terrible. They were packing, moving with a grim, silent purpose. They were a team now, bound by secrets and by the night. Clara strapped her knife to her boot. Eli was checking his pistol, reloading the chamber he had emptied. Bess, the horse, was in the lean-to, fed the last of the hay. She was still weak, but she could walk. They were ready to run. Then they heard it. A horse, not a posse, a single rider. "Get back!" Eli snapped. He shoved Clara behind him, toward the shadows by the cot. He raised his rifle, his body a solid, dangerous presence in the doorway. A man rode into the clearing. He was not a deputy. He wore an expensive dark wool coat and a bowler hat. He looked like a banker or a gambler. He reined in his fine bay horse, looking at the small, run-down cabin, the thin plume of smoke. He saw Eli standing in the doorway, a rifle in his hands. The man's eyes narrowed. He was not afraid. He was assessing. Then his gaze slid past Eli, into the dark cabin, and he saw her. He saw Clara, her face pale, her hair wild, peering from behind the man. A slow, greasy smile spread across the man's face. "Well, I'll be," he drawled, his voice carrying in the clear, cold air. "Mrs. Croft, we have been looking all over for you." He tipped his hat. "Mr. Croft is eager to have you home. He's offering a $500 reward for your safe return." He looked Clara up and down, his eyes lingering, insulting, though he might lower that reward, seeing the company you're keeping. He shifted his gaze to Eli, his smile all teeth. "You, sir, have just made a very powerful enemy. I'd hand the girl over if I were you. Mr. Croft can be forgiving." To an extent. Clara was frozen. She wasn't breathing. This was it, the tracker. He had found her. "I'll be back with the boys before noon," the man said, his arrogance thick. He began to turn his horse. "You stay put, Mrs. Croft. Don't make this any worse for yourself." The world exploded. Eli's rifle cracked, the sound a physical blow in the silent clearing. The snow at the horse's front feet erupted. The bay screamed, rearing high, its eyes white with terror, nearly throwing the man from the saddle. The man, in his panic, grabbed for the pistol on his hip, but he was clumsy, trying to control his mount. Eli didn't wait. He levered another round into the chamber. The snick-clack of the metal was the loudest sound Clara had ever heard. It was the sound of death. "Ride," Eli said, his voice pure ice. The man didn't need to be told twice. He forgot his gun, forgot his pride. He dug his heels into the horse's flanks, frantic, and galloped away, crashing through the trees. A coward in a fine coat, Eli didn't lower the rifle. He stood in the doorway, his body rigid. Scanning the trees, he waited. The sound of the horse faded. The man was gone. He finally turned, his face a grim mask. Clara hadn't moved. She had slid down the log wall, her legs giving out. She was in the corner, a small, dark heap, her arms wrapped tight around her knees, rocking back and forth, back and forth. A small, terrible keening sound was coming from her throat. She was gone. The woman who had kissed him, the woman who had shared her story, was gone. In her place was the broken, terrified girl from Cheyenne, the girl who had been locked in a room. Eli watched her for a long, hard moment. He saw her despair. He knew, with a sudden, terrible clarity, that if he went to her, if he comforted her, if he coddled her, she would be lost. She would be that broken girl forever. He had to save her, not just from the man, but from herself. He walked over, his boots heavy on the floor. He stood above her. His shadow fell across her, and she flinched, curling in on herself. "He's gone," Eli said, his voice hard, unforgiving. "He'll be back, with friends, before noon." She just rocked, the sound in her throat growing louder. "You don't have to run anymore," he said, his voice cutting through her fear. "You can stay here and wait for them to take you. You can die, or you can run with me." He crouched down, forcing her to see him. "But you have to decide what you want. Clara, right now, are you his property, or are you your own woman? You decide." He was offering her a choice, her life or her fear. He was offering her a fight. Clara's world was a small, dark, cold place, a corner of the cabin where she was rocking herself into nothing. Eli's voice was the only thing in it. "Are you his property, or are you your own woman? You decide." She stopped rocking. The keening sound in her throat died. She looked up. He was not offering comfort. He was offering a weapon. He was offering a choice she had never been given. His property, or her own. The fear did not vanish. It crystallized. It turned from a flooding, drowning panic into a single, sharp, cold piece of ice in her belly. She was done running. She was done being afraid. "I'm my own," she said, her voice a raw, broken sound. But it was her voice. She put her hand on the floor and pushed herself up. She was unsteady, but she stood. "Before noon," she said. "We need to go." They left the cabin without looking back. It had been a shelter, then a crucible, and now it was a tomb. They were leaving their old selves there, buried in the snow. Eli led Bess from the lean-to. The mare was skeletal, her breath pluming, but she was alive. He packed their meager supplies, the last of the flour, the rabbit meat, his pistol, her rifle. "She can't carry us both," Eli said, his eyes on the deep snow. "She can barely carry one. Then you ride." Clara said, "Your shoulder." "No," he said flatly. "You ride. I'll walk ahead and break a trail. If she gives out, we'll walk together. If we're lucky, this snow will hold the posse back, and it will cover our tracks." He laced his hands together. "Up you go." She put her boot in his hands and let him lift her into the saddle. She was a light weight. He handed her the rifle. "Keep it ready, and keep your eyes on the ridges." He took the reins and began to walk, plunging into the deep, unbroken white, pulling the horse and the woman forward by his own grim will. They headed south, toward the trading post towns, toward the world they had both tried to escape. The first 2 days were a silent, white hell. The world was a blinding glare, the snow so deep that Eli sank to his hips with every step. He moved with a slow, agonizing rhythm, a human snowplow, his bad shoulder screaming, his breath tearing at his raw lungs. Clara sat the horse, her hands and feet numb, her eyes scanning the horizon until they burned. They did not speak. They saved their breath for living. At night, they found shelter where they could. The first night was a hollow under a snow-laden spruce, a cold camp with no fire, huddled together for warmth, eating frozen rabbit meat and handfuls of snow for water. The second night, they found an abandoned soddy, half collapsed, its roof open to the sky, but its walls blocked the wind. They built a small, smokeless fire of dry sage they found buried in the snow. They sat shoulder to shoulder, sharing the last of the meat. The silence was no longer a wall between them. It was a shared space. "Your shoulder," she said, her voice quiet. "You're bleeding again." He glanced down. A dark stain was spreading on his mended shirt. He had torn the wound open, breaking the trail. "It'll heal. It won't if it rots," she said. She took the waterskin and a rag from her pack. By the dim firelight, she pushed his shirt aside. The wound was raw, an angry red, the stitches he'd pulled still holding, but just barely. She cleaned it, her touch gentle but firm, her movements efficient. He watched her face, lit by the small fire. The lines of panic were gone. The hollow, haunted look was gone. She was just Clara, thin, tired, and deeply alive. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, not looking up, her hands busy with the bandage. "We're a fine pair. Eli, you're half lame and I'm half wild." He let out a low chuckle. "But we're moving." "Yes," she said, tying the bandage. "We're moving." On the third day, the snowfields gave way to the high plains, the drifts shrinking, the mud and frozen grasses showing through. The going was faster. Bess seemed to find her strength, sensing a return to the world. They could ride together now. Clara in the saddle, Eli riding behind her, his good arm around her waist, holding her steady. She leaned back against his chest, a solid, warm presence. It was a practical, necessary closeness, and it felt more real than any kiss. They found an old barn, the shell of a failed homestead. It was a palace. It was dry, and there was old, dusty hay in the loft. They built a fire in the middle of the dirt floor. That night, they slept in the hayloft, buried in the hay for warmth. Clara fell asleep first, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion. Eli stayed awake, the rifle across his lap, and just watched her. The moonlight, thin and silver, came through a gap in the roof. It touched her face. He saw the harsh lines of fear and grief that had been etched around her mouth begin to smooth out in sleep. She looked younger. She looked peaceful. A strand of her dark hair had fallen across her cheek. He reached out, his calloused fingers hesitating, and gently, so gently, brushed it away. He let his thumb rest for a single second on her cheekbone. It was cold. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She saw him, his face inches from hers. She saw his hand, poised by her face. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She just looked at him, her gray eyes clear and quiet in the moonlight. A small, watery, hesitant smile touched her lips. It was the first. Eli's heart gave a painful, unfamiliar lurch. "You should sleep," he whispered, his voice thick. "You too," she whispered back. She didn't move away. She just closed her eyes. And in her sleep, she turned, pressing her back against his chest. Eli lay awake for a long time, his arm around her, the hay sharp and sweet-smelling around them. and just listened to her breathe. It took them 2 more days to reach the town. It wasn't much, just a muddy track called Four Forks, a collection of false front buildings huddled by a river crossing. A general store, a saloon, a livery, and a shabby 2-story inn. It was choked with trappers, a few soldiers from a nearby fort, and rough-looking prospectors. They were exposed. 2 fugitives, on a half-dead horse, with no money and a story that wouldn't hold. "Stay here," Eli said. He dismounted, his legs stiff. He helped her down. "I'll see what those furs from the cabin can buy us." Clara watched him walk toward the trading post. He moved stiffly, his shoulder high, but he walked like a man who owned the ground he was on. He was observant, his eyes never still. She saw him speak to a greasy-looking man in a buffalo coat, his voice low, his demeanor calm. He was good at this. He was a man who knew how to live in the shadows. She couldn't just stand there. She had to do her own part. She felt in the lining of her skirt, her fingers touching the hard, familiar shape. She had one thing left from her old life. She walked into the general store. It was a dim room that smelled of coffee, cured leather, and dust. The storekeeper's wife, a thin woman with tired eyes, looked up. "Help you?" Clara put her hand in her pocket and pulled out the brooch. It was a small, delicate thing of gold and seed pearls, a flower, a wedding gift from Arthur, a tiny, beautiful shackle. She hated it. "I need to sell this," Clara said, her voice clear. The woman took it, her eyes widening. She saw the quality. "It's lovely, stolen." "It's mine," Clara said, her gaze steady, challenging the woman. "I'm a widow. My husband died on the trail. I need money for a room and food." The woman looked at Clara's face, at the exhaustion, the deep, abiding sadness. She saw the chapped hands, the worn dress. She saw another woman whose life had gone wrong. "I can give you $10 for it," the woman said, her voice kind. It was worth 100, at least. It was robbery. "I'll take it," Clara said. The woman counted out the bills. Clara's hand closed around the money. It was the first money she had ever truly earned. It was hers. She had sold her past. When she walked out of the store, her back was straighter. Eli was waiting by the inn. He had a small sack of supplies. "Did you get it?" she asked. He nodded. "Got $20 for the pelts. And a man I know." He fixed us some papers. For another 5. He held them out. "Mr. and Mrs. Smith, from Missouri." Clara showed him the $10. "Mrs." Smith added to the fund. He looked at the money, then at her face. He saw the new strength there. "Well, Mrs. Smith," he said, the hint of a smile in his voice. "Let's get a room." The inn was as shabby on the inside as it was on the out. Their room was on the 2nd floor. It was small, cold, and smelled of stale whiskey, but it had a real bed with a quilt, a wash basin, and a door with a lock. Eli dropped the bar into place. The sound of the metal falling, shutting the world out, was the most beautiful sound Clara had ever heard. They were safe. For one night, they were safe. They washed the trail from their faces. The water in the pitcher was icy, but it felt good. They sat on the bed and ate the bread and cheese Eli had bought. They were so hungry it tasted like a feast. Night fell. The town, far from sleeping, came alive. The piano in the saloon downstairs started up, a tinny, cheerful, out-of-tune sound, punctuated by shouts and laughter. Clara was standing by the window, looking down at the muddy street. The music drifted up, a polka, a song from a life she had never been allowed to live. She could see men and women, shadows in the lamplight, moving in and out of the saloon. She turned from the window. Eli was on the bed, his back against the wall, cleaning his pistol. He looked up. She took off her heavy, mud-caked boots. The cold of the floorboards hit her bare feet, and she began to move. It wasn't a dance. Not really. It was just a swaying, a shifting of her weight. She closed her eyes, letting the clumsy, joyful music fill her. She raised her arms. She turned, a slow, barefoot circle in the middle of the shabby room. She was not Arthur's jewel. She was not a runaway. She was not afraid. She was just a woman, barefoot in a cold room, listening to music. She was reclaiming her own body, her own life, one small, hesitant movement at a time. Eli watched. He stopped cleaning the gun. His hands went still. He watched her with a kind of raw, painful awe. He saw the woman she must have been at 15, before her father sold her, before Croft broke her. He saw a spirit that had been locked in a dark room and was just now, finally, finding the light. It was the most beautiful, heartbreaking thing he had ever seen. She stopped, her breath coming fast, her face flushed. She opened her eyes and saw him watching her. The shame, the fear, it was all gone. She just looked at him, her chest rising and falling. "Do you still think I'm broken?" she whispered. Eli stood up. He walked to her, stopping just inches from her. He could feel the heat coming off her skin. He raised his hand, not to his shoulder, not to his gun, but to her face. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. "No," he said, his voice raw. "I think you're burning." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. He bent his head, and this time, there was no desperation. There was no anger. His lips met hers slowly, gently. It was a question. Her hands came up to his chest, not to pull him closer, but just to hold on. She kissed him back. It was slow. It was aching. It was full of a deep, profound, and painful need. He kissed her like a man drinking water after a week in the desert. She kissed him like a woman who was, for the first time, being seen. He lifted her into his arms, and she was light, and she was his, and he carried her to the bed. They fell onto the quilt, a tangle of clothes and quiet, desperate whispers. It was not a claiming, it was a healing. It was two broken halves fitting together, making a flawed, scarred, but complete whole. It was the only truth in a world of lies. The next morning, the world returned. They woke tangled together, the winter light gray in the room. There was a new ease, a new intimacy. He kissed her forehead. She smiled. A real, sleepy smile. "Stay here," he said. "I'll get some coffee. And see about a better horse. We can't stay long." He left. Clara lay in the bed, the warmth of him still on the sheets, and felt a dangerous, unfamiliar thing. Hope. He was gone for a long time. Too long. The hope began to sour, turning back into the old, familiar knot of fear. She dressed. She was pacing by the window when he finally came back. She saw his face, and the hope died. He was pale. His jaw was set, his eyes hard and cold. He shut the door and dropped the bar. He didn't look at her. He just held out a piece of paper. "They were posted all over the livery," he said, his voice dead. She took it. It was a bounty poster, crude, printed in thick black letters. It had his name, Eli Stevens, and beneath it, "Wanted for the murder of Deputy Owen Hancock." It offered a reward, $1,000. She read the words. "Shot an unarmed man in the back." Her blood ran cold. She looked up at him. "Eli, you told me, you said he pulled a gun on you." He couldn't meet her eyes. He walked to the window, his back to her, staring out at the muddy street. "I lied." "No," she whispered. "Not about the judge," he said, his voice flat. "Not about Thomas. That was all true. But Hancock, what happened in that office?" He took a deep, shuddering breath. "I told you I went to confront him. I did, but I found him in the back, in the cells." He stopped, his hand clenching into a fist. "They had a girl in there, a young Sioux girl. Picked her up for vagrancy. She couldn't have been more than 15. He turned to look at her, his face a mask of self-loathing. "Hancock, he was on top of her, on the cot. She wasn't even fighting. She was just gone. He was laughing." Clara put her hand over her mouth. "He saw me. He didn't even bother to pull his pants up. He just grinned at me." He told me it was a perk of the job. He told me if I was smart, I'd get my own before they sent her up to the fort. And then he saw my face. He saw what I was going to do, and he made a mistake. He reached for his gun. Clara whispered. Yes, Eli said. But he was slow. I was already drawing, and I didn't just stop him. Clara, I didn't just wound him. I emptied my gun. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. He stood there, the confession hanging in the air. He was a murderer, a killer. Everything the poster said was true, just not for the reasons it claimed. He had waited for her to trust him, and now he was waiting for her to run. Clara stared at him. She looked at the poster, at the lie of unarmed. She looked at the man who had shot another man 6 times, for what he'd done to a girl he didn't even know. She thought of Arthur Croft. She thought of the locked door, the corrections. She thought of the men who stood by and watched, who called her husband Sir. She thought of the man in the bowler hat, his greasy smile. Hancock, Croft, Harris. They were the same man. She was shaken, deeply, but she did not flee. She walked across the room and took the poster from his hand. She crumpled it into a ball, her movements sharp, angry. So we're both murderers, she said, her voice hard. He looked at her, confused. What? You killed a beast. He deserved it. You just did what I've dreamed of doing, what I didn't have the courage to do. She threw the crumpled paper into the cold hearth. Let's stop pretending to be saints. Eli, we're just what's left. He stared at her, a profound, disbelieving relief washing over him. She was not running. She was standing with him. But what do we do? He said, the old, hard reality crashing back. $1,000. Every bounty hunter in the territory will be on us. Harris will paper every town. And Croft, he'll have every road to Cheyenne watched. We can't go west. We can't go east. We're trapped. Clara turned from the hearth. The woman who had danced by moonlight was gone. The woman who had cowered in the cabin was gone. In her place was someone new, someone forged in snow and fear and truth. The fire Eli had seen in her was now a calm, steady, burning flame. No, she said, her voice quiet, but it was the strongest thing in the room. We're not trapped. We're free. Running. Running is what got us here. It's what they expect. She walked to him. What if we stop running? He looked at her. What are you saying? I'm saying, let's go back. Let's go to Cheyenne. Clara, that's suicide. Croft owns that town. Harris owns the law. And you know where Hancock kept his own secrets, she said, her eyes burning into his. You said it. The man was corrupt. He must have had his own ledgers, leverage on Judge Harris. And I have my own. I know their names. The other women, the girls, Arthur, kept, the men who helped him. I know where he keeps his real books. She put her hand on his chest, right over his heart. They're hunting us as criminals. What if we start hunting them as judges? We have nothing left to lose. Eli, nothing but this. He looked down at her hand, at the fierce, terrible, beautiful resolve in her face. It was suicide. It was a crazy, impossible, doomed plan. It was the only thing that made sense. They would die running, or they would die fighting. He covered her hand with his own. They'll kill us. They'll kill us anyway, she whispered. But not like this. Not in a ditch. Not in a cage. She stood on her toes, her face close to his, her eyes holding his. If I die beside you, she whispered, her voice fierce. It's better than surviving without ever being seen. Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory, was not just a town. It was Arthur Croft's personal kingdom. It was a scar of new money, mud, and ambition, sprawling along the railroad line. The cattle barons, the politicians, and the railroad men all drank at Croft's palace, a 3-story monument to vice that dominated the center of town. To ride into Cheyenne was to ride into the heart of his power. They sold Bess at a livery 2 towns over. She was too slow, too weak, and too recognizable. They bought 2 new mounts with the last of their money, strong, anonymous geldings. They bought ammunition. They bought a new coat for Eli, one that didn't have a mended bullet hole in the shoulder. They looked less like fugitives and more like homesteaders, worn down but respectable. It was the best disguise they had. The ride took 4 days. They spoke little. The decision they had made in the inn room at Four Forks had settled on them, a heavy, cold weight. This was not a plan for survival. It was a plan for justice. And justice, Eli knew, was just a prettier word for revenge. They were riding to a reckoning. They camped the last night in the hills overlooking the town. Cheyenne glittered below them. 1,000 false stars in the cold, clear dark. It looked like a celebration. "He'll be there," Clara said, her voice quiet, her arms wrapped around her knees. She was staring at the brightest light, the one that poured from the dozens of windows at Croft's palace. "This is his busiest night." "The sheriff's office," Eli said, his voice a low rumble. He was staring at a smaller, darker building. "It's 2 blocks down. Sheriff Miller, he was a new appointment when I left. Word was he was one of Harris's men, but Green, he won't help us. Eli, he's on the payroll." "Maybe," Eli said. He touched the oilskin pouch in his coat pocket. It was heavy. "But men like that, they have a price. And sometimes they just haven't been shown the truth. Or they haven't been made to fear it." Clara had given him the letters. They were her most precious, terrible secret. She had collected them over the years. Whispered conversations in hallways, notes slipped under doors, names of other girls, other wives, some in town, some in the brothels Croft also owned. Letters from families asking where their daughters had gone. One, from a girl named May, who had simply vanished after refusing one of Croft's private parties for the railroad men. It was a stack of paper, a thin, fragile sheaf of misery. It was the only weapon she had. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Once I give these to him, it's done." She nodded, not taking her eyes from the town. "I'm sure. I've carried them for 2 years. They're not just for me anymore. They're for May. They're for the girl in the cell, Eli." They rode in just before dawn, when the town was at its lowest ebb. The last of the drunks had been thrown out of the saloons, and the respectable folk had not yet risen. The streets were mud, frozen in deep, hard ruts. Their horses' hooves were loud, echoing off the false fronts. They took a room at the shabbiest boarding house, one near the train tracks, paying for 1 night. They locked the door. Clara sat on the lumpy bed. Eli stood by the window, watching the town wake up. He checked his pistol. He checked it again. "I'll go at noon," he said. "Miller will be at the saloon for his dinner. Croft buys him his meal. The office will be empty, save for a deputy, probably asleep." "And me?" she asked. You wait until you're sure. I'll meet you. Or I won't." "No," Clara said. She stood up. The woman who had danced barefoot, the woman who had cowered, was gone. This woman was a general. "You'll go at noon. You'll leave the letters. You'll go to the livery, and you'll have the horses saddled. You will be across the street from the palace. Not inside. You're too well known. Eli, your poster. It's probably hanging in his office." "Clara, I am not letting you walk in there alone." "You are," she said, her voice hard. "Absolute. This isn't your fight, not the way it's mine. You're the one who gets me out. I'm the one who walks in. He needs to see me. The town needs to see me. If you walk in first, you're just a gunman. I walk in. I'm his wife. I'm the one he beat. I'm the one he locked up. That's the story that has to be told." He saw the steel in her. He saw that she was right. It was a terrible, perfect, awful plan. "He'll kill you. He'll try," she said. "But he'll have to do it in front of everyone. He won't be able to lock this door, and I won't be alone. Not really." She touched the small derringer she had hidden in her skirt pocket, the one she had stolen from Arthur all those months ago. It was still loaded. At noon, Eli left. He walked down the street, just another cowboy, his hat pulled low. He saw Sheriff Miller, a big man with a florid face and a heavy gut, walk out of the office and head toward the palace. Eli waited. He counted to 100. He slipped into the alley. The back door of the sheriff's office was flimsy. It took him 10 seconds with his knife to slip the latch. The room was empty. A deputy was asleep at the front desk, his chair tilted back, his boots up. Eli moved like a shadow. He didn't go near the deputy. He went to Miller's desk. It was covered in papers, bounty posters. He saw his own tacked to the wall. He saw the warrants from Judge Harris. He didn't touch them. He just opened the top drawer. He placed the oilskin packet inside, right on top of a stack of blank warrants. He didn't hide it. He wanted it to be found. He slipped back out the door, into the alley, and was gone. He was just a ghost, planting seeds. He went to the livery, his heart a cold stone in his chest. He saddled the horses, his hands moving with mechanical purpose. He paid the hostler for a week's board, so the man wouldn't ask questions. He tied the horses just inside the wide stable doors, ready to run. Then he crossed the street, found a spot in the deep shadows between the gunsmith and the land office. And he waited. He was directly across from Croft's palace. He could see the swinging doors. He could see the men going in and out. And he waited. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. Clara waited until she felt the sun begin to dip, until the shadows grew long. 3 o'clock. The saloon would be full. The gamblers, the businessmen, the whores, his audience. She walked out of the boarding house. She did not run. She walked down the center of the muddy street. She kept her head high. Men turned to look at her. A lone woman, dressed in a plain, worn dress, walking with such purpose. She was not a whore. She was not a wife on an errand. She was something else. She reached the swinging doors of Croft's palace. She could hear the piano, a cheerful, soulless tune. She could smell the beer, the unwashed bodies, the expensive cigar smoke, the smell of her prison. She pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The saloon went silent. It was not an immediate silence. It was a slow, rolling wave of quiet, starting from the door and moving deep into the massive, glittering room. The piano player's hands fumbled and stopped. The click of the roulette ball ceased. Every man at the bar, at the tables, turned to look. She stood in the doorway, a small, dark figure against the bright, dusty light of the street. And then he saw her. Arthur Croft was standing at the far end of the long mahogany bar, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He was a big man, not tall, but thick. He wore a velvet vest, a gold watch chain draped across his stomach. His hair was black, oiled, and perfect. He had been laughing with a cattleman. His smile froze, then twisted into something dark and unrecognizable. "Clara," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence. It was a voice of pure possession. "Well, the bitch has come home." He put his glass on the bar. "I was wondering when that fool I sent would drag you back, boys," he said, his voice rising, thick with a rage he was barely holding in. "Looks like my wife is back. Go, welcome her." 2 of his men, heavy, brutal-looking men who served as his guards, pushed their chairs back and stood up. They started toward her. Clara did not move. She did not look at them. She looked only at her husband. "I'm not your wife, Arthur," she said, her voice shaking, but it carried. It was clear, and it was cold. "Not anymore." "What did you say?" he hissed, his face turning a dark red. He started to walk toward her, moving around the bar. You little whore. After all I gave you, you run off, you disgrace me. And then you walk back in here?" The 2 men were almost to her. "Grab her," Arthur spat. "Take her upstairs. Lock the door. I'll deal with her, personally, after I'm done here." One of the men reached for her, his beefy hand clamping down on her arm. "Come on, Missy. The boss wants you." Across the street, Eli saw the swinging doors shut. He saw the men inside stop to watch. He saw Clara disappear. He couldn't wait. He pulled his hat low, his pistol in his hand, and he started to walk. The man's grip was iron. He yanked her. Clara stumbled, but she didn't scream. She reached into her pocket. She said, her voice rising to a shout that shocked the entire room. I am not yours. She pulled the derringer. The man holding her arm just laughed. He thought it was a toy. Oh, she's... The saloon door crashed open. It wasn't a push. It was a kick. The doors flew off their hinges. Eli stood there, a tall shadow against the light, his face a mask of cold fury. In his right hand was his pistol, steady, aimed. Get your hands off her, he said. The man holding Clara didn't let go. He just stared. Arthur froze. Who in the hell are you? I'm the man who... Eli began. The man holding Clara was faster. He dropped her arm and pulled his own gun. He was a fool. Eli shot him. The explosion of the gun was deafening in the enclosed space. The man was thrown back, clutching his chest, a look of pure, stupid surprise on his face. He crashed into a card table, sending chips and glasses flying, and the world exploded. Kill him! Arthur Croft roared, diving behind the bar. The saloon erupted. The second guard drew his gun. Eli fired again, but the man was moving. The bullet tore a strip of wood from the bar. The guard fired back. The patrons screamed, diving for cover, overturning tables. A third man, a gambler at a front table, drew his own pistol. Eli was exposed. Eli! Clara screamed. The gambler turned to her. Eli shot him. The guard shot at Eli, the bullet whining past his ear. It was chaos. A man by the bar, a simple drunk, stood up. Hey! He started, and was hit by a stray bullet. He collapsed. Get down! Eli roared at Clara. He dived forward, rolling behind an overturned oak table. A bullet sparked off the floor where he had been. He was pinned. He's behind the table, the guard yelled. Clara was on her knees. One of Arthur's men, a bartender, was vaulting over the bar, a shotgun in his hands, coming at Eli from the side. He hadn't seen her. No! Clara screamed. She aimed the small derringer, her hands shaking, and pulled the trigger. The gun bucked. The bartender stopped. He looked down at the small, red stain on his shirt, as if he couldn't believe it. He fell, the shotgun clattering to the floor. He had knocked over a lantern. The kerosene spilled across the wooden floor, across the spilled whiskey. The flame from the broken chimney touched it. A line of blue-white fire ran across the floor and hit the bar, the bottles behind the bar. The cheap, high-proof whiskey began to explode. Fire! Someone screamed. The chaos turned to pure, animal panic. Men were trampling each other, fighting to get to the back door. The windows, the guard who had been shooting at Eli forgot him. Turning to run from the flames, the whole bar was an inferno. The fire was climbing the walls, catching the curtains. Black, choking smoke filled the room. Clara! Eli roared. He burst from behind his cover. He saw her, on her knees, staring at the man she had shot. She was in shock. The roof was catching. A burning beam fell, crashing where Eli had just been. He ran through the smoke, grabbed her by the arm, and yanked her to her feet. Move, now! He dragged her, half carrying her, toward the shattered doorway. The heat was a solid wall, blistering their skin. The smoke was so thick they couldn't breathe. They burst out onto the street, collapsing onto the muddy boardwalk, gulping at the clean, cold air. The saloon was a funeral pyre. Flames were shooting from the second-story windows. The entire town was in the street, staring, their faces orange in the light of the fire. Clara! Eli panted, his lungs raw. Are you... A voice, thick with hate, cut through the roar of the fire. You... whore! Arthur Croft was standing 20 feet away. He had come out a side door, his fine velvet vest smoking, his face black with soot. In his hand was a pistol. He was looking at Clara. He was looking at her with a pure, murderous hatred. You burned it, he whispered, his voice cracking. My place, you, bitch! He raised the pistol. He aimed it, not at Eli. He aimed it at Clara. He was going to kill his property. Eli saw it. He moved, pushing himself in front of her, but his legs were tangled. He was too slow. Croft! A new voice boomed. Sheriff Miller was standing in the middle of the street, his own shotgun leveled. His face was pale. He wasn't looking at the fire. He was looking at Arthur Croft. "Put it down, Arthur," Miller said. His voice was shaking. It's over. It's over when she's dead," Croft screamed. He swung his pistol toward the sheriff. "You work for me." "No," Miller said. His voice was low, full of a sudden, terrible shame. "Not anymore." Croft made his choice. He swung the gun back to Clara. He was going to take her with him. His finger tightened on the trigger. The sheriff's shotgun roared. The blast hit Arthur Croft square in the chest. It lifted him off his feet and threw him back into the mud, a broken, bloody heap. He was dead before he hit the ground. The town was silent. There was only the sound of the fire, the crackle and roar of the palace dying. Clara stared. At the body. At the fire. At the man who had owned her. Now just a pile of wet rags in the street. She turned to Eli. He was leaning against a post, his face gray. "Eli." He looked down at his shirt. It was soaked. In the fight, in the chaos, a bullet had found him. It had torn through the same shoulder, the old wound, shattering the new-healed flesh. He slid down the post and collapsed into the ashes and mud. "Eli!" She ran to him, falling to her knees. She tore his coat open. It was a sea of red. "No, no, no, not now!" She pressed her hands to the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Her own hands black with soot, now slick with his blood. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice fierce. "You stay. You promised." He looked up at her, his vision swimming. Did we win? We're alive," she sobbed. "Just stay alive." Boots crunched in the street. Sheriff Miller stood over them, the shotgun still smoking in his hand. He looked at the man he had just killed. He looked at the burning building. He looked at the woman holding the wounded outlaw. He looked at the letters on his desk, the ones he had found when he ran back to his office. He saw the truth. "You," he said, his voice rough. He nudged Eli with his boot. "You're Eli Stevens. You're worth $1,000. Clara looked up, her face a mask of fury. But," the sheriff said, cutting her off. "I never saw him. I never saw you." He looked at the burning saloon, at the body of Arthur Croft. "All I saw was a terrible accident. Mr. Croft, drunk, tried to shoot at the fire, and his gun, it went off." He looked down at them, his eyes old and tired. "This town, it's going to be chaos. Harris will hear of this. Croft's men will want blood." He chambered another round into the shotgun. "A warning. You best disappear. I give you, until the moon is high. Then I start looking, and I'll find who I'm paid to find." He turned and walked away, shouting orders to the townsfolk, organizing a bucket brigade, a man suddenly in charge of his own town. Clara bent down to Eli. He was still conscious. "You heard the man," she whispered. She kissed him. A hard, desperate kiss, tasting of soot and blood and gunpowder. "I'm not running anymore," she said, her forehead pressed to his. "I'll go wherever you are." He tried to smile. "Good." She got her shoulder under his good arm and pulled. He groaned, but he found his feet. He was a dead weight. She was strong. She dragged him, step by agonizing step, away from the firelight, into the dark alleys, toward the livery. They left Cheyenne an hour later, under the high, cold light of the moon. They rode east, into the plains, away from the burning town. Her hands were black, caked with soot. His shirt was a solid mass of darkening blood. They were wounded and hunted and free. They rode north for 3 weeks. They rode until the high, empty plains of Wyoming gave way to the jagged, snow-capped teeth of the Beartooth Range, and then descended into the sheltered valleys of Montana Territory. It was a land that felt new, unwritten, a place so vast and empty it could swallow 2 fugitives whole. Eli had nearly died. The ride from Cheyenne, the second bullet in the same shoulder, had poisoned his blood. He was burning with fever by the second night, slumping in the saddle, held on only by her. Clara had saved him. She had found a creek, boiled her own skirt for clean bandages, and forced water and the last of their food down his throat. She had hunted for him, cleaned the weeping wound, and sat through his fever dreams, this time holding his hand, her other hand on a rifle. She had been the strong one. She had been the rock. When the fever finally broke, he had woken to see her face, thin and exhausted, outlined against a pale Montana sky. "You stayed," he'd whispered. "I promised," she'd said. They found the shack in a hollow carved by a fast-running creek, 10 miles from any trail. It was an old trapper's cabin, like the first, but this one was built of sturdier logs, with a sound roof and a stone chimney that drew true. It was empty. It was safe. It was theirs. The seasons turned. The last snows of that long winter melted, and the creek swelled, its roar a constant, comforting presence. Spring came, painting the valley in a sudden, violent blush of green and blue, and with the spring, they settled. They had been there for 6 months. The cabin was no longer a shack. It was a home. The mud-chinked walls were clean. The single window was patched with a new piece of greased paper. There was a rough-sawn table Eli had built, and 2 stools. Life fell into a rhythm, one dictated by the sun and the land. Eli worked outside. His shoulder had healed, but it was a ruin. The muscle was a hard knot of scar tissue, and the cold mornings left him stiff and aching. He could no longer draw a gun with the speed he once had. He no longer needed to. Instead, he used an axe to fell lodgepole pines, splitting them into rails. He was building a fence. It was a small, 3-railed rectangle, enclosing a patch of cleared land by the cabin. It was an absurd, hopeful, and necessary thing. It was an act of permanence. Clara worked the trap lines. She had learned the land, the way the rabbits moved, the places the grouse gathered. She provided their meat, her rifle a familiar weight in her hands. She was no longer running. She was rooted. The high, sharp angles of her face had softened. The fear in her eyes, the constant, hunted look that had followed her from Cheyenne, was gone. It had been replaced by a deep, quiet calm. They had scars. They would always have scars. Sometimes she would wake in the deep night, her heart hammering, the smell of cigar smoke and stale whiskey in her nose, her hand reaching for the derringer that was no longer there. He would wake with her, his arm coming around her, not to trap her, but to anchor her. He would just hold her, his solid warmth a shield against the ghosts, until her breathing slowed. Sometimes he would be splitting wood, and the sharp crack of the axe would make him flinch, his eyes flying to the ridges, his hand dropping to the pistol he still wore on his hip. He was still the deputy. He was still the man who had lost his brother. One night, she found him by the creek, staring into the fast water, his face a mask of old, cold grief. She didn't speak. She just sat beside him and took his hand. He had laced his fingers with hers, his thumb rubbing the chapped skin of her knuckles. "It was his birthday," he said, his voice quiet. "Thomas, he would have been 20. Tell me about him." She'd whispered, and he had. For the first time, he spoke of his brother, not of his death, but of his life, of the way he'd fished, the way he'd laughed, the terrible jokes he told. Clara had just listened, her presence a silent absolution. But the scars were no longer all they were. The cabin, which had held so much silence and pain, now held laughter. It was a sound that was new to both of them. It happened when Eli, attempting to fix the roof, slipped and landed in the mud. He had sat there, stunned and covered, and looked at her. She had stared, her hand over her mouth, and then a small, choked sound had escaped. It grew, bubbling up from a place she thought was dead, until she was leaning against the cabin wall, tears rolling down her face, helpless with a pure, uncomplicated joy. He had grinned, a slow, rusty expression, and thrown a handful of mud at her. The quiet moments were better. In the evenings, the day's work done, the fire lit, she would read to him. She had one book, a small, battered volume of poetry she had bought from a peddler. She had traded 2 perfect rabbit skins for it. The poet wrote of the ocean, of endless water, of freedom. She sat on the hearth, her feet tucked under her, the book in her lap. "Listen to this, Eli. The sea is wide, and my boat is small." He would sit at the table, his hands busy mending a piece of harness, but his attention was on her. He loved to hear her read. Her voice, which had been so sharp with fear, was now soft, musical. He watched the firelight catch the brown of her hair, the serious, peaceful line of her mouth. She looked up, catching him watching her. "What?" "Nothing," he'd said, his voice rough. "Just, you're like that. What he says. Like the sea?" "No," he'd said, setting the harness aside. "You're wild as the wind. No man can build a fence high enough to hold you. Clara, not even me." It was the finest thing anyone had ever said to her. The peddler, an old man named Silas, came through every 2 months. He was their one link to the world, their one risk. He brought coffee, sugar, flour, and news. He told them of the Indian wars to the south, of the railroad pushing north. He never mentioned a bounty on a man named Stevens, or a search for a woman named Croft. The world had forgotten them. They were, blessedly, too small to matter. On his last visit, Silas had offered to take mail east, heading back to Fort Laramie, he'd said, then down to Denver. "Got a letter?" Clara had been still for a long time. That night, by the lantern, she wrote. It took her an hour. Her hand cramped. She was writing to a girl named May, one of the women who had been trapped in Croft's palace. May had been a maid, a quiet girl who had seen everything, a girl Arthur had sometimes used, and then locked away. Clara had helped her once, slipped her food. May had been the one to warn her that Arthur was growing suspicious, giving Clara the final push she needed to run. She didn't know if May was alive. She didn't know if she was still in Cheyenne. She addressed the letter to the general store, in care of the shopkeeper's wife who had bought her brooch. She wrote, "May, he is gone. The palace burned. I am safe. I am alive. I hope this finds you. I hope you are free. I am praying for you. Your friend, C." She sealed it and gave it to Silas, along with a silver coin. It felt like burying a ghost. It was the last piece of Cheyenne. With the past laid to rest, they began, hesitantly, to speak of the future. It was a new language for them. "That patch of ground I cleared," Eli said one night, staring into the fire. "It's good soil, by the creek." "It is," she agreed, darning one of his socks. "We could, maybe, raise some chickens, get a hen from Silas, and plant corn, maybe beans." She stopped darning. She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the floor, nervous, as if he were asking for something he had no right to. He was asking for it tomorrow. "I like corn," she said softly. He looked up, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Me too." They were building something. It was fragile, this talk of chickens and corn. It was a hope so new it was terrifying. But it was real. It was a root sinking into the dark, rich soil of the valley. One morning, Clara woke to a cold cabin. The place beside her on the narrow bed was empty. The fire was banked, a few coals glowing in the ash. A sudden, sharp, familiar cold gripped her heart. He's gone. The old panic surged. He had left. He had finally left. The posse, the bounty. He had gotten tired of her, of being fenced in. She sat bolt upright, her hair wild, her eyes darting around the empty room. "Eli?" Only the sound of the creek answered. She scrambled from the bed, her bare feet hitting the cold floor. The cabin felt hollow, empty. She was alone. The terror of the last 2 years washed over her. She had been a fool to believe, a fool to hope, a fool to build a life with a man who was born to run. And then she saw it. On the rough-hewn table, placed squarely in the center, was a scrap of paper, torn from a sack of flour, held down by his heavy hunting knife. On it, written in clumsy, blocky letters, were 2 words. "Say please." She stared at the note. Her heart, which had been a cold stone, gave a painful lurch. The terror didn't just recede, it vanished, washed away in a sudden, hot flood. She picked up the note. Her vision blurred. She sank onto the stool, her shoulders shaking, and pressed the rough paper to her lips. She smiled. It was a wide, watery, aching smile. And the tears that came were not for fear or for grief. They were for the sheer, impossible, unbearable joy of it. He hadn't left. He was hunting. For them. He was building their life, their future. And he had left her a promise. She spent the day in a haze of quiet work. She fed the 2 horses. She checked her traps, returning with 2 rabbits. She cleaned the cabin. She made a stew, keeping it warm by the fire. And she waited. But it was a new kind of waiting. It was not the nervous, fearful waiting of the cabin in Wyoming. It was the calm, certain waiting of a woman who knows her man is coming home. The sun was just beginning to touch the western peaks, painting the valley in shades of gold and deep purple, when she heard him, the sound of a single horse, walking steady. She stood in the doorway, her hands clasped, and watched him ride out of the trees. He was not the fugitive. He was not the wounded deputy. He was just Eli, his shoulders set, his hat pulled low. He had a young buck deer slung over his horse. He reined in, his gaze finding her in the doorway. He didn't smile. Not quite, but his eyes, which had been so cold and hard when she'd first met him, were warm. He swung down from the saddle. He was tired, his clothes stained from the hunt. He walked to the cabin, unbuckling his gun belt, letting it hang from his hand. He tossed his heavy coat onto a chair. He tossed the gun belt onto the table. Next to her note, Clara hadn't moved. She was still in the doorway, her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm. He walked toward her. She backed up a step, into the cabin, into the warm, fire-lit shadows. He followed. He didn't stop until his body was inches from hers, until her back was pressed gently against the solid log wall. He put his hands on the wall on either side of her head, caging her in. But it was not a cage. It was an embrace. He was so close she could feel the cold air coming off his clothes, and the heat of the man beneath. She could smell the pine and the cold air, and the man himself. She looked up at him, her eyes dark in the twilight. She whispered, her voice rough. "Hurry up." He paused. A slow smile, the one she had earned, touched the corner of his mouth. He bent his head, his lips hovering an inch from hers. He was so close. His breath ghosted across her skin. "Say please," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly promise. "Then I'll obey." He didn't wait for the word. His mouth found hers. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of the past. It was not the aching, healing kiss of the inn. This was a kiss of knowing. It was slow and deep and sure. It was the kiss of a man who knew every inch of her, and of a woman who was not afraid to be known. His hands left the wall, one tangling in her hair, pulling her head back, the other sliding down her back, pulling her flush against him. Her arms wrapped around his neck, her fingers digging into his shoulders. It was skin against skin, the cold of his cheek against the warmth of hers. It was breath in the cold air, their breath mingling in a single, visible cloud. It was a love that had been forged in survival, that had been tempered in blood and fire, and had now settled into something as real and solid as the mountains around them. It was a love that was, finally, safe. The next day, Eli was at the far end of the clearing, setting the final posts for the fence. He worked with a steady, rhythmic thud of the axe. Clara was kneeling in the soft, dark earth beside the cabin wall. The sun was warm on her back. In her hand was a small cloth packet, the last gift from Silas, the peddler, wildflower seeds, a mix of lupine and columbine and prairie fire. It was a foolish thing to plant flowers. They couldn't eat them. They wouldn't keep them warm. But she pressed her thumb into the dirt, making a small hollow, and dropped a few of the tiny seeds in. She covered them, her hands, which had been so red and chapped, now caked with a dark, rich soil. She was planting. She was putting down roots. She looked up, her gaze going to Eli. He had stopped working. He was watching her, leaning on his axe, his hat pushed back. He was just watching her plant flowers. A feeling, one she couldn't name, swelled in her chest. It was so big it almost hurt. It was peace. It was safety. It was his face, watching her. "Eli," she said, her voice quiet, but it carried on the clear air. He nodded, listening. She looked down at the dark patch of earth, at the promise of flowers. "Maybe," she said, her voice thick. "Maybe this is what home feels like." Eli watched her for a long, quiet moment. He looked at the cabin, at the fence he was building, at the woman kneeling in the dirt. He took off his hat, his dark hair ruffled by the wind. He replied, his voice a low, steady promise. "Only if you stay." Thank you for listening to this story from all of us here at From Wild West. We truly hope it brought you a piece of the old world. We would love to know where you are listening from. So please, drop a comment and let us know. If you enjoyed this tale, we hope you'll subscribe to From Wild West, so you never miss a new story. We'd be mighty grateful if you'd share your thoughts on the story in English. Your words mean the world to us.